Today we'll be looking at a case from the early Victorian era, so sit back as we go to the mill town of Hyde in Cheshire. Henry Arkwright was 46 in the autumn of 1837 and, by the modest standards of his street, a success of the quiet sort. He kept a small weaving concern with his partner, Josiah Booth, a water wheel, a handful of power looms, and a dozen boys whose whistling carried through the yard at noon. At home on Market Street stood a neat brick house with a clipped hedge and shutters that came down at dusk. Eliza, his wife, tended the rooms with an economy that never looked mean. Their daughter, Anne, had begun her letters and could recite 2 psalms by heart. A nephew, George Loomis, walked daily between warehouse and office with a clerk's ledger under his arm, learning the trade in the shelter of Henry's steadiness. He was a man of habits rather than impulses. He paid into a burial club, kept his pew at St. George's, polished his silver verge watch on Saturdays, and wrote in a small compressed hand that never wasted an inch of paper. The year before, in a solicitor's back room, he had executed a simple will, leaving everything to Eliza and Anne after the discharge of the firm's debts. He sealed it with green wax, a quirk adopted long ago to distinguish private papers from partnership business. The watchman knew his step, the parish clerk his signature, and his foreman the way he counted cloth by touch as much as by eye. By October, the times had gone sour. The panic of 1837 had crossed the Atlantic in rumors and then in facts. Cloth sat in the warehouse longer than it should. The Manchester agents delayed remittances, and Booth fretted aloud about cash flow. Henry, no lover of borrowing, would say they must pare debt, not principal, and if that meant short time for a fortnight, then short time it must be. George, who had a way of looking agreeable to every speaker, nodded along with both men depending on which one stood nearer. On the night of the 18th, the watchman, Peter Shaw, noted a candle still burning in the counting-house after the shutters should have been closed. He tried the door and found it fast from within as he went round by the narrow alley and eased the hasp on a rear window, a trick he knew in case a master locked himself out. He heard a heavy thud, wood to wood, as if a chair had gone over. Inside, the candle threw a long shadow of the desk across the floorboards. Henry lay near the corner of the desk, one hand still touching the quill, the ledger open at a page of figures. A shallow bruise sat along his right temple, the kind that comes from catching the edge of furniture on the way down. He did not breathe. Shaw ran for Booth, and the church warden roused the surgeon, Mr. James Barrett, before dawn. The inquest met at the White Horse under Coroner Robert Haywood. Barrett's account did not raise the room. The body showed no marks of violence save the slight bruise. The pulse had gone long since. The face was suffused, not pinched. He spoke of apoplexy, of a heart that stops without permission. He found no sign to make him suspect poison or struggle. The door had been shut from the inside. Henry's keys lay by it. The jury, neighbors all, wrote their verdict in a few lines: death by natural causes, the fall incidental. The parish arranged burial. Eliza, white but composed, moved through these formalities as one does when a flood lifts a household and sets it down again in a different field. What would have stayed an ordinary death became something else 3 weeks later, when George Loomis brought forth a paper he called Henry's final will. It bore the date of the 1st of September, 1837. In it, the works and near total authority passed to George. Eliza would receive a small annuity, and Anne a modest provision for schooling until her majority. The signature read Henry Arkwright in a hand that, to the untrained eye, could be his. A glossy red wafer seal bore the impressed initials H.A. Beneath, 2 men had signed as witnesses: William Nadine, an ostler known about the yard, and Thomas Bell, the errand boy from Holland's the stationer. Eliza looked once, and then again, and then set the paper down with a firmness that made the table creak. Henry, she said, sealed important private papers with green wax. He had done so for years. She spread out older letters and the earlier will and showed the particularities a wife knows: the way Henry's T crossed short, the loop of the K closed tight, the faint tremor at the end of the flourish when he signed after a page of steady script. The new signature had the shape but not, she said, the fatigue. George shrugged, too ready by half. Hands vary by mood and hour. A stationer sells you the wax he has. Probate in that season belonged to the old order still. Parliament had indeed passed a new law of wills that summer, but its strict forms would not take effect. until January of 1838. Until then, ecclesiastical courts judged testaments, and because Henry's property lay across dioceses, his will would be proved, or not, at Doctors' Commons in London, before the Prerogative Court of Canterbury. George sent the new will there. Eliza lodged a caveat. The court held back administration and asked for evidence. Evidence, to be useful, begins with the common things. Mr. Hollins, the stationer, turned the sheet to the light. "Whatman, 1834, he said, pointing to the watermark ghosting through the paper. He explained that the year only marked the paper's making. The sheet itself could be used any time after. But a note in his shop book showed that this batch, watermark and all, had not come to his counter until the summer of 1837. That fact proved nothing by itself, and yet placed the sheet within a span that mattered. Thomas Bell, the boy, fidgeted under questions. He thought he had seen Mr. Edmund Close, attorney, take such paper. The name made Eliza's head lift. Close had lately been advising George on arrangements. The seal yielded smaller, sharper observations. Clerks who had seen Henry seal his private papers recalled the habit that made their work easier. He dusted the die with ash before pressing, to keep wax from sticking. On the red wafer of the new will, the gloss was unbroken, the minute stippling of ash absent. The HA was clean, the edge smooth. A man could change wax and yet keep his habit. Or a different man, imitating the first, could forget it. Doctors' Commons sent for a writing master, Nathaniel Sharp of Manchester, who had often testified on hands and seals. He studied Henry's ledgers, letters, receipts, and the earlier will. To the jury's ears later, his manner sounded fussy until it became convincing. He said that much of the new signature accorded with Henry's, the proportions, the slope, the spacing. But he noted that the terminal sweep of the T crossed further than Henry's usual. The tail of the G in Arkwright fell in a line a fraction too straight, and under a glass the ink showed two tiny breaks where the pen seemed to have been lifted in the middle of a flourish, a habit Henry's genuine hand did not show. He held the sheet to the light and traced a crease that ran through the signature. In common use, he said, a man reads a paper, then folds it, then pockets it. If he signs after folding, the ridge of dried ink on the crease bears tiny cracks. Here, the ink lay smooth across the fold, as if the sheet had been folded first and then signed upon a firm surface. Each point was small. Taken together, they arranged themselves into a pattern. The court in London, reluctant to decide the forgery question from paper alone, signaled Cheshire to present the matter criminally if it would, and the civil probate was stalled until the criminal court could judge whether a crime had preceded it. At the Cheshire Assizes of 1838, a grand jury indicted George Loomis for forging a testament and Mr. Edmund Close for uttering it as true. The courtroom smelled of damp wool and lamp oil. The gallery held faces from Hyde and Stockport who had paid the coach fare to witness a quarrel that might have been theirs on another day. Eliza sat back, her hands laced, the look on her face the practiced restraint of a woman who must not, in public, be seen to weep. The prosecution's narrative was tidy without being neat. A locked counting house, a sudden collapse, and a doctor's conclusion of natural death. Weeks later, a new will that reversed the settled will and the character of the deceased, benefiting almost entirely a single man not of the principal line. The paper came first. Hollins's ledger was produced to show when certain Whatman sheets had been stocked. The boy Bell admitted he had handled such sheets for Mr. Close. Then the seal. A foreman described Henry's ash-dusting habit, and the jurors passed the red wafer hand to hand and saw only gloss. The writing master stood longest. He did not thunder, he explained. He showed, under a lens, the pen lifts. He showed, under the same lens, where the line quivered in a way that suggested careful mimicry, not ordinary habit. He demonstrated with another sheet and a drop of ink how a fold would crack a signature made in the ordinary order of affairs. He did not say forgery until pressed. Then he said it. The defense sought the shade wherever it lay. Men sign differently when they are ill, when they are vexed, or when they have written a long day. Watermarks mark manufacture, not use. Wax colors depend upon what the shop has to hand. Witnesses, lawfully summoned, can sign in any order. If Henry and Booth had quarreled over cash, as men whispered, might not Henry have resolved to keep the works kin-bound under his nephew? A reliable motive, they implied, lay in the quarrel, not in greed. The first crack in their plank came from the ostler, William Nadine, who had attested the will. He said he had signed near dusk, hearing the warehouse bell and the distant clatter from the yard. Under cross, he was asked what he had done that evening after. He said he had taken his wife to the Stockport Fair. A gaming stall keeper, whom no one expected to matter, produced a little book in which he wrote names and wagers. W. Nadine, he read out, with the hour marked near 8. That hour sat ill with the dusk bell at Hyde, if Nadine had truly stayed to sign. The defense called it confusion in a laborer's memory. The jury wrote it down as a discrepancy that favored the Crown. Attorney Close fared worse. He admitted advising George about arrangements and supplying paper. Asked whether he had seen both witnesses sign, he answered that in his view they were present. The Crown's counsel, a spare man with an edge in his voice, asked whether he meant in your view or in truth. Close said in truth, and then paused just long enough to strengthen the wrong syllable. It made no proof by itself, it made a poor impression overall. The defense called Josiah Booth toward the end. He looked a man who had slept badly for months. He said he had not known of a new will. He said he and Henry had indeed disagreed about how quickly to cut wages, but that Henry had not threatened to put the works into his nephew's hands. He said that had Henry proposed such a thing, he would have seen it at once in the man's face, because Henry wore his heavy decisions plainly when they were made. The judge's charge took pains to separate outrage from proof. A will is a solemn thing, he said. A forged will, if proved forged, is a crime peculiarly mean. But what was required here was not indignation but conviction. If the jury believed the writing a forgery, they must convict the maker. If they believed the paper was uttered knowing it to be false, they must convict the utterer. If they found the matter uncertain, acquittal must follow. He said nothing about Henry's death. That verdict belonged to another room and another day. The jury held out for 2 hours, arguing the way small towns do when they sit in judgment on one of their own. They returned with a verdict of guilty against George Loomis for forging and against Edmund Close for uttering. The judge sentenced both to imprisonment with hard labor. The court in London, relieved of the obstruction, restored probate to Henry's earlier, simple will. Eliza became administratrix for herself and for Anne. George went to prison, and, when he came out, found that men looked away before they met his eyes. Close shut his office. His seal lay dull under dust in a drawer. Nothing in the criminal business unsettled the coroner's finding about Henry's end. The death remained natural or accidental, the bruise on the temple the work of a fall rather than a blow. But the quiet that ought to have followed was broken by a paper whose lines were too careful to be true. In Hyde they called it the case of the silent will, not because the thing spoke softly, but because it did not speak at all. It was a mouth moving without breath, an attempt to make a dead man say what he had never said. The case changed small habits before it changed any laws. Stationers in Hyde and Stockport began to keep sharper notes about their paper. Batches entered with dates, wax colors mentioned in receipts. Clerks, when they saw a gentleman pull out a seal, dusted the die with ash, because Henry always had, and men take sense from example faster than they take it from statutes. Writing masters like Sharp raised their fees and found themselves in coaches bound for county towns on wet mornings to hold glass lenses over doubtful strokes before juries who leaned forward as if the law lay in the tremor of an ink line. When, in January 1838, the New Wills Act took effect, its requirement of 2 witnesses signing together and its plainer form of execution promised less room for mischief. In offices from Chester to Manchester, solicitors lifted the Arkwright file when clients asked why such punctilio was necessary. Because, they would say, the ink dries with fewer stories in it if you make it dry under 2 honest eyes at once. Eliza did not sell the works at once, though some advised her to. She kept Booth and made him show her every figure until the numbers spoke as plainly to her as they had to Henry. She took a tutor for Anne. On Sundays she walked the gravel path through St. George's Yard, stopped at the stone that now bore Henry's name and 2 dates, and left a leaf on its ledge. In a breeze, the leaf trembled as if a finger passing over letters could set something right. Of George, time wrote a smaller page. He worked for a coal merchant after, married late, and did not prosper. Children pointed sometimes and said "Will George" under their breath because children repeat what they hear. Of close, there was less to tell. He moved, men said, to a cousin's in Macclesfield, where he drafted conveyances for men who had never heard of Doctors' Commons and would not have cared if they had. Nothing in this story needed a poison, a pursuit, or a pistol. It required only paper, ink, wax, and the temptation that creeps up the weaker of us when grief loosens a house and order wobbles. The tempting thought that cunning can carry a man over a threshold merit will not open. From the start, Henry's case offered two plain lessons to anyone patient enough to read them. The first is that the most dangerous hand in a room is not always the one that grips a knife. It is sometimes the one that holds a pen. The second is that the law, slow as it often is, can learn to hear the truth in the smallest noises, a pen lifting where it never lifted before, a seal too glossy by a hair, a crease that should have cracked and did not. The last consequence is the ordinary one that never makes the broadsides. After the verdicts were printed and the coachman had argued them out in the yard, after the last neighbor stopped at Eliza's gate with a dish and a story, life in Hyde settled back into the color of smoke it had always had. The water wheel turned. The boys whistled. Booth fretted in his way and learned a little patience. Eliza kept a sharper book than Henry had, not because she doubted him, but because she had learned from being doubted how clean a book needs to be. Anne grew, and years later, when a clerk in another town took up a sheet and a stick of wax to make a testament, he dusted the die lightly with ash before he pressed it down. He had never heard of Henry Arkwright. He had learned the habit from a man who had learned it from another man. That is how a case becomes a warning, and then a custom, and then a quiet improvement, which is the best kind of ending the law can give to any death it did not cause.